everyone, and welcome to the Lesbian Talk Shows for Love and Money, the podcast where we talk about the business side of selling sapphic fiction. Today, we have a really awesome guest who is going to discuss pitching your work and querying agents. The awesome J.S. Fields. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on the podcast with me today.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
So, agents. A lot of sapphic fiction doesn't really use them. People prefer to indie publish or query the publishing houses directly. What made you decide to start querying agents, and how did you begin?
Well, I think that's it. First of all, that's a really interesting statement because there actually is quite a bit of, as you say, sapphic fiction in traditionally published work as well. It just doesn't necessarily get billed the same. And so I was completely unaware of the more small press side of lesfic when I started writing, and I was only familiar with mainstream, of which there is quite a bit. But again, it tends to get buried in science fiction and fantasy and not billed as lesbian fiction. And so I started off querying my work, and I had decent luck. And in the end, I actually had two agents that showed a great deal of interest. And then Nine Star Press, which is the small press that I have published my space lesbian books in, also showed interest. And I actually just went back and forth between agents and small press for a while, trying to decide what was the best fit for me, and ended up going with small press for the Argillum series, mostly because at that stage I was fairly new to fiction writing. I've written nonfiction for quite a while, but I was new to fiction writing, and I had a very specific vision that I wanted for the Argillum books that was not commercial. And I realized that I needed, if I really wanted to keep them intact the way they were, they weren't going to sell as much as a traditional publisher would want. And so I chose small press. However, I then promptly wrote a new book that would work in a commercial market, and then went back out and got an agent for that. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
I think it's a great answer. And I'm really curious to know, what do you think about your queries caught the attention of these agents? What are the ingredients in the recipe of a good query?
There is definitively a recipe for queries, and there are so many resources online that you can look at. But you have to learn how. First of all, you have to know what you wrote about, and you have to. If you can't describe your book in under a sentence to two sentences, really, then you can't be querying. You have to be able to distill your book down into its most critical elements, to have sort of a tag pitch line. And you also have to then be able to summarize the main commercial grabs of your book in one small paragraph. And I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that your previous writing credentials don't really matter. Your ability to put in cute little gimmicky things about how much you know about the agent because you stalked their blog doesn't really matter. What matters is a good solid pitch. You can have comp titles if you want. A lot of people do use, this is Ash meets Star Wars or something like that. If you're going to use comp titles, they need to be something that is fairly recent and something that did well. So you're not going to score any points by using a comp title, sadly, from something in small press, because that's not sending a very large commercial message. Unless it did really well, like Becky Chambers' Small Way to an Angry Planet is a great comp title if you are looking at the sort of mid-range commercial market. So comp titles, I didn't have them the first time around, and I did the second time. I'm not sure how much of an advantage they gave. But being able, again, to talk about what makes your book stand apart, which usually can go in that first sort of hook, 2 or 3 sentences, and then your sort of blurb, it's what you would put on the back jacket, more or less, that goes into your query letter. That is absolutely critical.
I have a lot of agreement with what you just said, because at Klexicon, which I recently attended, and other conventions, I have to convince people to buy my books in like a sentence, because that's all I get before they move on to the next booth. So I have to be able to say, like, this story is Cinderella but gay, and that gets their attention. Could you give us an example of one of your books? Could you give us the 2 sentence pitch so people can see what you're talking about?
So this query letter is broken down into 3 paragraphs. Sometimes you can get away with 4 if you have writing street cred, which I did. I've got a number of books over in nonfiction and have done a lot of journal articles and things like that. So I would put that information in there. But mostly you want to have 3 paragraphs, and there's sort of 2 different ways to do it. They don't necessarily have to be in this order, but this is the order I use. You have dear, and then you want to make sure it's personalized. I put in the book's tagline, which is "The planet that vanishes, the planet that sleeps," as the hook line. And then there's the sort of mandatory information that you have to have. So I'm seeking representation for it was at that point 87,000 word science fiction manuscript, Argillum First Dawn. Attached is whatever they requested. I then talked about my plans for the book. So this work is the first in a 3-book series, all of which are written, which you don't have to do if you're trying to get an agent who subs to big presses. Having a series isn't necessarily useful and may be detrimental depending upon the agent you're querying. So you really have to look at that. Almost everyone will want your first book to stand alone. So if it is part of a series, what you usually say is, this book stands alone but has series potential or something along those lines. And then I have the manuscript is a character-driven space opera reminiscent of The Rowan by Anne McCaffrey. Now, this is my first query letter, and that's actually that comp is a little too old. As I got better at it, I changed the comps around a little bit. And then I put in sort of my hook information that was based upon what the agent was looking for. And so if I was on manuscript wish list or on their page and they said, they were looking for character-driven space opera, I made sure it said character-driven space opera. If they were looking for, lesbians, then I made sure it said lesbians. This particular iteration here the manuscript has characters outside the gender binary, which is something that this particular agent was looking for, and passes both the Bechdel test and the Mako-Mori, which again was something that the agent had specifically listed on their site as, don't submit to me if your manuscript cannot hit these.
Well, good for them.
Yeah, so then this goes into the blurb, the second paragraph, and literally this blurb is just the back blurb of the book, and it actually, for the book, the publisher ended up keeping, I'd say, 75% of this paragraph actually for the black blurb and just cut it down a little bit. And the trick with these is a good book has a lot of elements in it that all weave together. But you can't talk about all of those in a query letter because that's a synopsis and that's different. And so you have to decide what those main thematic elements are and pull those out. So, I'm not sure what type of genre readers you mostly have, but if we were to talk about, say, again, Becky Chambers' The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, that has so many thematic elements in it, and there's so many POV characters. And so in order to write a blurb for something like that, Becky had to focus on either the overarching narrative. So there's a ragtag group of people that are hurtling through space, getting to know each other, or pick, sort of the main, if there was one, and I don't recall there being a specific main group in that book, pick that one and highlight it. And it's the same for a lot of books where you have, especially multiple POV characters, you have to sort of pick one or pick the main plot theme and highlight that because no one wants to read more than about 6 sentences in this.
Yeah, that seems like it can be especially difficult if you're writing things of large scope, as I do with fantasy and sci-fi. I love romances too, modern day romances, but it seems a little more straightforward with that. But when you have a big sprawling world, it seems you have to be especially thoughtful about how you narrow in on what you want the main focus to be and be able to convey that to other people.
It's really tricky, especially in sci-fi and fantasy, which is where I write. It was easier for Argillum because it was a very straightforward space opera that utilized a lot of tropes. And, all all genre writing has tropes. Romance has tropes, science fiction has tropes. And not only are they helpful to ground your reader, but they can be very helpful in a query because it saves you a lot of time. You don't have to describe your like grumpy space captain. That's a trope that you can just, assume that people understand when you say space opera, and that saves you space in writing.
You are my new best friend. I have done entire podcasts about why tropes are actually good if you pull them off well, and about how they're helpful to writing instead of, people have this misconception that tropes are like a bad thing and they're not original, but nothing is original. It's all about the packaging, and tropes actually make readers feel like they know your characters and your story even better.
Well, they're so
So,
helpful if you're going to be trying to put in things that will make readers uncomfortable. They have to have something to cling to. And so, especially so in our dilemma, I put actual science in there because I'm a scientist. And so there's hard science sprinkled throughout there. And I knew that was going to freak people out. And the best way then for me to figure out how to deal with it was let's make the rest of the book as comfortably tropish as possible so that people can find themselves in it and find these very comfortable spaces. And then they can deal with the weirdness. And I think a lot of books that are successful do that. They introduce you to an element, but give you enough comfort that you can deal with that new element.
exactly. I mean, I actually like hard science in my sci-fi when there is also enough humanity, for lack of a better word, or sentience if you're dealing with aliens, to make me feel like I can relate.
Yeah, I think that's a really critical element.
You're listening to The Lesbian Talk Show. TheLesbianTalkShow.com, your hub of podcast information.
How much control do you actually have over your manuscript and the direction you want to take it when you work with bigger publishers? I've always been very curious to ask that.
That really, how much control you have really depends. But the short answer is you don't have as much. With a small press, and I think a lot of your listeners will be very familiar, you actually do have quite a bit of freedom because, they know you're not going to be hitting the New York Times bestseller list. And so as long as you're hitting the important areas within whatever genre you're writing in, it tends to be fine. But for larger press, even mid-size press, they have to look at their bottom lines and they know what sells and what doesn't, to some extent. They're, of course, wrong, just like we can be wrong sometimes. But there's a lot more of them making large decisions and then sending it to you and you being able to say, I need you to tweak some things, but not really being able to, if they commission cover art for your book, you can't just scrap it, unless it's like really offensive in some way. You can't just be like, you already paid this artist and, but it just doesn't work for me. That's, that doesn't tend to be one of those things that you can do. And your agent in particular, your first interaction with this will be your agent. And your agents they run the gauntlet from, you spend years with them fine tuning your work before they sub it out. And you have really hands off agents that are just like, hey, could you just like fix the third act? And then, they don't read it again and send it out. So it really, that part, you have to find an agent that really works with your writing style. If you prefer a deep hands-on versus, don't touch me, leave me alone, let's just go to the publishers. So you lose control, but you increase sales. And I think I think a lot of people sort of inherently understand that. Your editors will be a little bit more picky on the mid-size and large press side. I mean, no matter where you're at, in nonfiction, fiction, because again, they have formats that they know work for their readers. The publishing house knows their demographic of readers and know what they expect, just like how readers, in lesfic, contemporary lesfic, expect certain tropes, and science fiction readers expect certain tropes. If you buy a book from Angry Robot versus buying a book, I don't know, from Penguin, there's some differences there that you're going to expect, and they know that. And so you have to make sure that you can't argue with them too much. I mean, you can, but it may not go anywhere.
I want to go back to what you said about how agents have different styles. what clues can you look for on like an agent's website or their online presence to try and figure out if an agent style will kind of mesh with yours? How do you know if you're querying the right agent for your manuscript and for you?
I don't think there is a way to know with the querying process. It's really hard to tell unless they have a blog that you can follow. Usually the really deep personality introspection comes after an agent has offered. So at the querying stage, you just sort of are casting a wide net, sending out a bunch of queries to agents who look legit, and who represent the kind of stuff you write, which is critical. I mean, you don't want to submit epic space opera to a picture book agent. That's clearly not going to work out for you. What kind of agenting do you do? How much of an editor are you? What are, those kind of things? Those are a lot of questions that come when the agent calls. So if you get an email from an agent saying, hey, I liked your query. Can I give you a call? First of all, that's horrifically nerve-wracking. And then they call you, and that's when you have a list of questions that you kind of go down. The neat thing is if you can sort of gather a group of friends who are agented and talk, you can find out quite a bit about that just from talking to other agented writers. Most of the time when you talk to an agent, if they're getting ready to offer, you can ask for contact for some of their other authors. And that's really nice too, because you can contact their other authors and say, what do you like best about this agent? What do you like least about this agent? How do you find their editorial style? Make sure it matches with what the what the agent thinks. So yes, it can be very hard at the just querying end to figure out if you're going to be a good fit. Unfortunately, there's not like a database of agent personalities that you can go through and be like, this one's an asshole but sells a lot of books, and this one is highly editorial and likes middle grade. Like, there's just not that sort of thing.
Yeah, in a perfect world for authors, maybe there would be, but I get what you're saying. I'm so glad that you mentioned talking to other authors who potentially work with the agent you're interested in. And I'm so glad you made it sound like a mutually beneficial relationship, because it is. I mean, I think lots of writers kind of assume if they were to query an agent that they should just accept any agent because having one is better than not having one, and that they should, they're in a more subservient position. So I'm really glad that you described it as, I said, a mutually beneficial relationship. Like, obviously, an agent can let go of a writer if things aren't working, but also a writer can let go of an agent who isn't helping their manuscript in the way they envisioned. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And I'd argue that the wrong agent is far worse for your career than no agent. I mean, there are plenty of people who do fine without agents. Not, I mean, reaching that bestsellers list, if that's your goal, can be a lot harder, but it's not, that's not unachievable. But having the wrong agent can really set you back in terms of publishing, and it can also make your life miserable. Like if you are someone who has a really hard time with comma usage and things like that, and really needs someone to go in and really edit your work, like deeply edit your work, but the concept is good, and you get an agent who loves your work and thinks it's great, but doesn't have those necessarily like deep editorial desires, that could hurt you. But what would hurt you worse is if your agent, didn't really understand your book, shopped it to the wrong places. There are some bad agents out there that, can be too aggressive or flat out lie when they're trying to. It's really nerve-wracking when you get the call and talking to a potential agent, but you have to collect yourself and realize that it's not just them interviewing you, it's you interviewing them, and that, you get a say in this.
As you should. It's your book. You wrote it. You should get a say in it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for agreeing to be on this podcast and sharing your wisdom with us. We're going to wrap up now, but if you had one piece of advice to give authors who are interested in querying agents and larger publishers, what would it be? Put you on the spot there.
Get onto a site like Absolute Right or Query Shark or one of those and get other people to look at your query, especially people who have agents, because just having your friends and family read it or going through it is not enough. You need lots of eyes on it. Really get it sparkling before you query.
That's amazing advice, and I'll put those links in the show notes too so that people can check out those websites. But yeah, that's brilliant, getting other authors who are already agented and have done this process before to look at your query in advance. That sounds like a great idea. Thank you so much again for being on the show. This was awesome.
Yes, thank you.
You're listening to the Lesbian Talk Shows for Love and Money with Rae D. Magden and our special guest, J.S. Fields. We talked about querying agents, publishing with larger publishers as opposed to small presses, and all sorts of cool stuff about narrowing down the theme of your works. If you'd like to continue the conversation, please go to the Lesbian Talk Shows Facebook group, or check out the Lesbian Talk Show's Patreon page where you can find exclusive clips not found anywhere else. Thank you and have a great 2 weeks.